Starcraft represents perhaps one of the most beloved intellectual properties in gaming, and in 2026, the Starcraft miniatures wargame is finally seeing global launch. So, while I'm waiting on my own shipping notification, Archon, over the last couple of weeks, I've had a chance to actually sit down and digest the rules. I've put some models on the table, I've rolled some dice, I've made some mistakes and learned from a few of them, and while I've done nothing resembling an actual full-sized game, I've got some initial impressions and design thoughts that I hope you'll find interesting. So, let's talk about StarCraft, the tabletop miniatures game. Now, firstly, what this video is and is not. This is an initial design impressions for StarCraft the miniatures game. It's things that I'm excited for, it's some things I'm concerned about, it's my initial design observations and my initial tactical-ish appraisal of the three factions. What it's not is an in-depth, detailed, or strongly considered appraisal of StarCraft. I have not played a full game yet. I've read the rules, I've moved models around, I've got a good handle on how things like movement and damage happen, and I've got initial thoughts I think are interesting, but if you're looking for a nuanced, competitive opinion, that will need to wait until I have models on the table. I will have those opinions eventually, but for now, we're just talking about design observations and initial impressions. So, at a high level, if you haven't looked at this at all yourself, what is StarCraft the miniatures game like? Well, overall, I would describe it as a very 2026 game. It absolutely innovates in places, but when it's not, it's very comfortable just borrowing modern industry best practice. If you have played wargames in 2024, 2025, or 2026, there will be things here that you are used to and familiar with, and kind of taking best of breed mechanical ideas from a lot of different games, Games Workshop games and otherwise. But at a very high level, the game is played in three phases. This will be kind of familiar to Warhammer players. You've got movement, you've got charging and shooting, you've got close combat. Obviously, those don't line up one-to-one with Warhammer or Warhammer 40k, but the idea of game turns in phases is familiar. Where StarCraft first differentiates itself then is in alternating activations, which is something that I would consider pretty solid industry best practice in this year of 2026. Some games are still married to the sacred cow of you play your entire turn before your opponent gets a turn with no real interaction other than making saving throws, but modern game design likes to keep player mental downtime limited, and StarCraft does that with alternating activations. I activate a unit, you activate a unit. I activate a unit, you activate a unit. The first person to pass each phase gets to choose who goes first the next phase until all three phases have played out and the game passes on to the next of usually 5 turns. Armies are constructed and constrained by a couple of different things. The first is points cost. Something like 1,000 points is a skirmish game, 2,000 points is a full-size competition game, but also a mechanic called supply, which we'll talk about a lot over the course of this video because it's one of the things that StarCraft innovates in. But supply limits both what you can actually fit into an army, functioning as a kind of field allowance mechanic, but also how quickly your army can deploy onto the battlefield. You've got 5 rounds per game, usually, with escalating supply each round. So you can start with a small force, not your entire army, and then slowly deploy initial models, then additional models, until finally everything arrives. Perhaps not until the end of the game, or perhaps earlier if some of your models die and free up supply to make new deployments. In terms of scenario play, you have scenarios that are drafted by combining a deployment and an objective layout, which then creates an mission that uses those objectives and deployment, which is a very cool system. In terms of actually constructing a list, your list will be comprised of a couple of different things. You'll have a faction and tactical cards. You always get one faction card per army. That will be something like Reyna's Raiders or the Terran Armed Forces. That's the overall force that you're playing within the faction. There are 2 of these available per faction at the moment for 6 total forces, but we expect a lot of these added to the game over the course of its development. Next, you add tactical cards, which in a sense represent your base. They're all themed that way. It's things like barracks and factories and armories, or gateways and nexuses, or hatcheries and hydralisk dens, etc. But what they actually are is paid for with a secondary currency that scales with your points, and they are your resources that you fuel abilities with. In another piece of design that is borrowed from other games but really does represent industry best practice, each of these buildings, tactical cards, can either be used for its own ability or used to fuel the abilities of your units, meaning that each round a Terran player, for example, might choose between using their barracks to use its go 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 ability to accelerate one of your infantry units, or using the barracks instead to fuel the ability of one of the units in your army, maybe using the stim packs on your marines or the healing on your medics. That gives you an immediate per turn constrained resource pool, but a lot of flexibility in how you apply it, which is really cool. The second thing that these buildings do is that they give you your supply limits. Supply is broken up into general categories: core units, elite units, support units, and heroes. At the moment, we might see more categories in future. And so you need to take tactical cards that unlock the supply slots that you need to actually take the troops that you want. This creates an immediate tension in list construction, because one building might give you a really cool ability or a lot of resources, but not a lot of the supply that you need, and another building might give you the supply you need to expand the force to include the troops that you want, but is perhaps less useful in terms of its abilities or how many resources it offers. So some very crunchy list construction, even before we get into actually adding the regiments into your army. Now, a lot of the abilities that can be used by units across the different factions and the buildings across the different factions can be very powerful, but an immediate piece of good practice design emerges because there are really tight constraints about when and where things can be used. Almost every ability will have a very narrow window that a player can use it in. Often that'll be only during the movement phase when a unit is activating and at no other time. If you want to stim your Marines, you do so during their activation during your movement phase. At the beginning, usually, potentially at the end, but you can't stim after the fact. And that's particularly important when you get into abilities that have other effects. There is very little out of sequence movement. Reactions are very carefully constrained. And when you combine this with the fact that your opponent's resource pools and abilities are all open and public information, one of the things the game does that sets it apart from games like, for example, A Song of Ice and Fire is very carefully limit gotcha moments. There are powerful ability combinations in this game, but the combination of open information and timing constraints tends to mean that players should always know what each other are capable of, and as new rules are added both to lists and to the game at large, those should mostly be additive to complexity rather than multiplicative of complexity. And that's important for the long-term health, because if you have multiplicative complexity, where each ability has potentially dozens of different timing interactions and unit interactions, the more each ability that is added to the game, or each unit or rule that's added to the game, could potentially interact with other things, and the times at which it could interact, the harder the game is to balance, and the more potential there is for unintended abuse or imbalance. To put this very bluntly, over the course of the last couple of weeks reading the rules, I have had multiple instances of reading something and going, oh shit, is that broken? And then you read a little bit further and you find the rules reference and you look at the timing and you go, oh, nope, no, actually the devs thought of this. That's good, but it doesn't crack the system right open. And that's very promising. And that kind of sets us up for my first impression of StarCraft, which is that it is a very carefully curated and evocative out-of-the-box experience. The devs have put a lot of work and thought into this, and you can see the testing cycle that's happened as well. But even just at the developmental level, the game has understood what it's trying to evoke. Even just with the initial unit releases for the three factions, they feel analogous to their PC game counterparts, not just in terms of one-to-one abilities, but also theme and the cumulative mechanical effect in play, almost to a fault, particularly when it comes to theming. This is, to be very clear, a StarCraft the PC game, the miniatures game, not a StarCraft the broad narrative universe, the miniatures game. It definitely includes a lot of evocative elements, and it doesn't tie itself completely one-to-one with the PC game, but there are a lot of nods that make it very clear that this is a game both about the broader narrative universe of StarCraft, but also for people who have played the PC game. There are tactics cards like Terran Barracks, and then there are tactics cards like Terran Proxy Barracks. And if you haven't played the PC game, that might not mean anything at all to you. Now, this is probably a pretty sensible bet, because almost everyone who is excited for StarCraft will be excited because of the PC game. And I think at this point it's probably pretty well understood what a 6 pool is, as opposed to just a Zergling spawning pool, but I think they could maybe have dialed that back just a little bit. The person that I sat down to play through my first, not even a demo, just rolling some dice and moving models around, was a big fan of StarCraft and competitive StarCraft. I follow StarCraft, mostly StarCraft 1, but I follow it competitively as well, and we recognized what the game was trying to evoke and communicate mechanically, and I think they could have had just a bit more confidence about that and been a little bit less on the nose. But that's a personal opinion. I suspect there are many people who are big fans of the PC game who will take the little nods for what they are, which is fun. At a high level, I've said, okay, we have a curated and evocative out of the box experience, but that's not just talking about the mechanical abilities of units and the fact that zealots feel like zealots and zerglings feel like zerglings. There are some things happening underneath the hood inside StarCraft that make the game fun, but also make the game quite good as an onboarding experience, which I think is going to end up being very valuable, especially for people who have narrow or limited wargames experience. This is probably going to be a quite good experience as a wargame, both for people who haven't really played wargames much at all but are huge StarCraft fans, and for people who, for example, have mostly just played Games Workshop properties, but are a big enough fan of the StarCraft IP to try something different. And I think that's very sharp. And there's two design elements in particular that stand out to me even at this initial impression, and which I want to talk about. Those are how carefully the game manages its damage economy and how it includes, at a very baseline level, some interesting anti-snowball mechanics. Firstly, the game's damage economy, which I think is very dialed in. Now, players who have actual play experience, please jump in to contradict me here if your experience has been that things just get blown out very quickly. But my personal observation, and it's from a limited amount of experience, is that the game has a number of effects baked into the core rules and the design of units that make damage you deal to other players and their units carefully calibrated. Firstly, just at the unit level, I feel like most units do enough damage in each attack to be meaningful, but not to easily one-shot their targets. If you just break down the damage math of unit versus unit, you will almost always accomplish something with an attack, but most units don't have the damage output to easily one-shot something in their own weight class. There are some exceptions, and you can absolutely stack force multipliers onto units, but by default, the experience of one unit fighting one other unit is that it's going to take at least a couple of rounds of engagement, that is to say play, to have a decisively resolved combat. That is going to keep action live over the course of multiple turns, rather than having things resolved too quickly or too explosively and not giving players a chance to feel like they're in the game or accomplishing things or responding. And that is further accentuated by the fact that force concentration in this game is very carefully constrained. You can dial in the unit versus unit damage quite well to encourage or require multiple rounds of engagement before a decisive resolution occurs, but that doesn't matter if it's easy to force concentrate, if it's easy for two units to gang up on one and therefore defeat it quickly before it has a chance to do anything. And there are multiple mechanics in StarCraft that keep players from being able to easily concentrate force. One of them is the alternating activation sequence, where even in the live combat rounds, players will be activating back and forth, and you might be able to do something like take a run action, which is a movement that you take in the assault, that's the shooting phase, to get a unit out of range of something that might be shooting them before they have a chance to shoot. But the big one is how the game handles shooting into and while in melee. A unit that is in melee can still make, for lack of a better term, ballistic skill attack, a shooting attack. It's usually going to be hampered by the fact that your opponent will get an extra save, called an evade save. There's this whole level of mechanics there. But a unit that gets charged and engaged in combat during the assault phase still gets to shoot, just slightly hampered. What you can't have without a particular special rule is shooting from outside a melee into a melee. And that means that when a unit of Zerglings or a unit of Zealots or something like that is closing with the enemy and about to make a charge, they might get shot, but once they get into melee, the only way something can attack them is either by being in melee with them or charging into melee with them, or having a weapon with a specific rule. And what that does, outside of Terran versus Terran matchups where basically everything is shooting, is give players the tools to engineer one-on-one matchups, and especially to prevent prevent gun lines from force concentrating and defeating opponents in detail. You can still force concentrate in Starcraft, but it isn't going to be the default. It's going to be something that as players you have to do through clever play. Or at least this is a very initial impression, but I think what the devs are aiming for and what I think they have probably succeeded in, especially for new players who are having their onboarding games, is a game where most of the time units won't one-tap one another unless one player either puts a lot of resources into force multiplying a specific unit with abilities and upgrades, etc., or makes a particularly clever play. And especially on the release of a game into the broader market where people are all learning at the same time, having a damage economy that is dialed in this way is sharp. It means players get to throw punches at each other's units in a way that feels weighty but not easily deliver knockout blows, which means that play keeps continuing turn on turn and is more likely to feel live all the way to the end of the game. And complementing that are our other mechanics, which I've kind of categorized as anti-snowball mechanics. And these are the effect of the supply system in play and how you decide who is first player during each phase. And these two abilities, I think, combine to act in part as rubber band mechanics, but more importantly as anti-snowball mechanics in a way that I think is really good for players who are learning the game. Now, firstly, just what is an anti-snowball or a rubber band mechanic? In games, the snowball effect occurs when one player does something that gets them an advantage, and it might be as simple as winning a dice roll or making a really good attack. And by getting that advantage, they often diminish their opponent's advantage, but in short, they are in a position where they are now in the stronger position during a game. When you are in a stronger position during a game, it is easier or more likely to accrue further advantage, which can mean that the first player to get a little bit ahead in a game that does not have anti-snowball mechanics very quickly just snowballs to a win, rather than having a game where multiple plays and multiple cumulative decisions and dice rolls and moves determine the winner. And so having a game that is structured in a way that prevents the snowball effect from occurring decisively is really valuable. And in addition to the damage economy, which we talked about, supply and first player are anti-snowball mechanics in Starcraft that I think are very clever. So let's talk about the first player token first. This is the token that determines who is the first player. Importantly, the first player decides who moves first. It might be advantageous to move first so that you can get more moves in before passing. We'll talk about that in a second. Or it might be advantageous to be the second person to move, especially during the movement phase, so that you can respond more adroitly to your opponent. In either case, the person who finishes or passes first gets the first player token in the next phase, so it will pass hands back and forth often during a game, and potentially create some interesting choices where you might choose to cut your movement phase short in order to go first, i.e. shoot or charge first in the assault phase. But in all cases, at the beginning of a round, before the movement phase in that round, the first player token goes to the player who has the fewest victory points, rolling off in the case of a tie. Now, both players are going to have a lot of agency here, but the person who starts the round with the token will have slightly more in the way of choice. And so the first player token serves a number of effects. We'll talk about one of them at the end of this slide, but the first of those effects that it serves is just by being an anti-snowball effect, by belonging by default at the beginning of a round to whoever is behind in terms of score. Now, the second and probably more significant effect that functions as an anti-snowball tool is supply as a mechanic, in particular supply during the course of a game. Now, your list might have 9 or 10 or 11 or 12 or whatever supply total, but you aren't going to begin the game with all of that in play. Even at the 2,000 point level, you'll often only start with 6 supply available to you, then getting a couple more each round. And so how the game is designed to play is in this escalating manner, where players get more and more forces, and they deploy those forces responsively, responding to what their opponent is doing, deploying units that are good against other units, or to contest objectives that your opponent is going after, or perhaps to seize objectives that are left alone. And all of that provides a good and interesting dynamic, but it also serves as an anti-snowball or rubber banding mechanic by ensuring that until the later phases of the game, both players, even if one player delivers a powerful early blow, both players will still have about the same resources for at least the first few of those 5 turns. Now, one player will run out of reserves first. One player will sustain more damage early, and so be less able to reinforce late, but supply as a tool, as a mechanic, it keeps the window open before that snowball effect kicks in. If my opponent makes some very clever play and really just bombs into me with a Terran unit that gets a kill that I didn't expect because Terran are very fast as a faction, and shit, I've had a whole unit of Zerglings killed before they could do anything, wow, that was a great dice roll, that matters, but it matters a little in the short term and then more in the long term. Because next round, I'll be down that supply of that Zergling unit, and so I'll have more space to reinforce. I can bring more of my army on, maybe get lucky and punish the overextension of that Marine unit. And so the advantage my opponent has accrued with that aggressive play absolutely matters, but it matters over the longer run. And that is really clever. Supply in general is just going to be one of the most important mechanics in the game, and one of the most important and interesting things that StarCraft does mechanically as a wargame, because it serves multiple different purposes. It serves as an interesting constraint and friction in list construction. It serves as an escalating drama, tension, release of tension, and conclusion mechanic, curating the experience of the game in play, and it serves as an anti-snowball mechanic, at least for the initial terms. What it also does, just as another secondary note alongside the first player token, is that it functions as a hedge against activation control. Now, this might not mean anything to players who are not familiar with alternating activation games, but a perennial challenge that has to be solved by designers in an alternating activation game is how to keep lists with very high activation counts balanced. How do you make sure that the person running a small number of elite regiments has an approximately balanced game against a person running many small units when the fundamental mechanics of alternating activation favor the many small units? Because you will go and I will go, and you will go and I will go, and then you will be out of units to activate, and I will have a great deal of tactical and strategic flexibility to perfectly activate all of my remaining units in the full knowledge that you have no response to them. I can make some very powerful plays in every game. Every game that has ever played alternating activations, this is a design problem that needs to be solved. Song of Ice and Fire, Conquest, Star Wars Legion, etc. These have had to decide how they would balance one player choosing to have an activation advantage as part of their list construction. StarCraft puts a bunch of hedges on this. One of them is supply, but perhaps the more important one is the first player token. There are also a lot of things just baked into list construction, where making a larger, more elite regiment is often very attractively costed, particularly from a points level, and then just generally the supply constraints in the game, I have found, don't completely remove the ability to make activation control lists, but they limit it to a point where it's probably pretty tolerable. But in particular, the first player token, the fact that if I'm playing against a person who has 3 or 4 more actions than me in the movement phase, well, I will at least get to go first in the assault phase and shoot first in that engagement. That's very promising, and it's just one example of how these mechanics that are mostly pretty unique to StarCraft are going to have outsized effects on the game mechanically, and be the unique value proposition StarCraft has from a mechanical perspective once you move past the fact that what we're also doing here is simulating all of these beloved factions from a beloved video game IP. But talking about those factions, let's run through some initial impressions of each of the 3 factions in the game. Now, these are going to be high level. I will talk about how I think these factions will play, but I am very prepared to be wrong about a lot of these. Not just immediately, because there are almost certainly people out there who have actually played plenty of games of StarCraft by now, either on the playtest team or on Tabletop Simulator using the available mod, but also because we only have the Wave 1 releases right now. There is a lot that is coming. We're expecting Siege Tanks, Immortals, and Ravagers to follow relatively shortly after the Wave 1 release, and those will change how the rest of the game plays around them. But for now, here are my initial impressions for each of the 3 factions, starting with Protoss. So Protoss at launch have kind of two distinct mechanical themes. The first is just that they are kind of the numbers faction. Their units are often powerful and in particular durable relative to their points cost compared to other factions. Now, they have access to as an army, but also tend to spend slightly more supply. And this can act as a little bit of a hedge against that slightly more powerful unit per point, because if you are spending more supply, it will take longer for your army to arrive, even if units on a unit by unit basis are a little bit more powerful. Now, my immediate observation is that players are choosing mostly not to engage with that, and especially the supply to cost of zealots is kind of making people just not want to play them. Even though, as a unit, pound for pound, zealots very effectively evoke what they kind of feel like in the PC game, where if you have a zealot up against two marines and that fight is just happening statically, you're like, oh wow, yeah, he is much more powerful than those two 50 minerals marines. The supply cost of a unit of zealots is 2 rather than 1 for things like adepts. And so even if the unit is durable and dangerous from a points perspective, the fact that they cost 2 supply is making players go, no, I'll just mostly run stalkers and adepts. Now, I think that might actually be causing players to overlook build options and overlook the potential of more late game oriented play, but on the other hand, there's only 5 rounds in a game of Starcraft. We don't have a long tail on games like we do in some games like, for example, Conquest, who have a similar system to Starcraft supply in the form of the reinforcement rolls in Conquest. And so perhaps actually it is just objectively correct to not run supply to zealots except in rare occasions. I don't know if it is, but it is something I've seen players talk about and is a constraint on the faction. Now, the second mechanical theme of Protoss, in addition to just powerful and durable units, augmented by shields and basic durability, etc., is that Protoss units tend to have transformative but self-contained special abilities. Stalkers have their blink ability, adepts have their shade, which they throw out in the movement phase. It provides a small buff, but then also they can teleport to it at the end of the turn. And those abilities are both transformative to the unit. They provide major changes to how the unit would play relative to not having that. Stalkers are just a well-statted and dangerous unit, but Blink gives them ability to both launch an alpha strike and just generally traverse the battlefield in a way that is tremendously flexible. And adepts with shades present that same mental load to your opponent, where they could be in one place or the other at the end of the round, in addition to just having access to it as a telegraphed but extremely powerful movement tool. And this is a theme I think we can expect to see carry on into future releases, because it is kind of how Protoss played in the PC game, where the units were often individually mechanically powerful, but then also had abilities that were enormously transformative on an individual unit by individual unit level. And this sets them apart mechanically from the other two factions, especially Zerg, where abilities tend to apply more at the whole of force level, very much apropos for a faction that is the Swarm. The second of our two factions is Terrans. And while I am probably the least confident in my appraisal of Protoss as a faction, I'm really the least sure about how they will actually play, and I'm definitely most prepared to be wrong with regards to them. Terran, I think I've got a little bit of a dial in on, and I really like how they've been designed. I would describe Terrans as a firepower faction done right. Because yes, Terran are the gunline faction, but they avoid the game falling into the trap of trying to make a viable gunline faction that is not also a mobile faction. One of the things that can happen in any game that has ranged combat and melee combat as an element is that unless you introduce some significant secondary thematic mechanical element to a faction design, having just a gunline faction can often be a very significant trap, because gunline factions, how they will usually work is that they will try and shoot their opponent before their opponent closes, and to be competitively viable, they have to be able to do that, and therein lies the trap. If a non-mobile gunline faction is competitively viable, it's because they can shoot their opponent off the board before their opponent gets into melee, which means by definition, to make a viable static gunline faction, you must render non-viable factions that are trying to close to melee. Very happily, Starcraft does not fall into this trap because they give the Terrans a very strong secondary theme of maneuver. Yes, all Terrans are built for ranged combat, but they are not a static firepower faction. They are actually very, very mobile, often with multiple stacking abilities that can allow for extremely rapid movement on almost any unit. Now, I will note all of this basically refers to Terran bio armies, which comprises most but not all of the initial Wave 1 release. This is all with regards to Jim Raynor and Marines and Marauders and Medics. The Goliath, which is also a model that exists, only has access to a much smaller subset of these, things like ready for pickup in Raynor's Raiders. It can't, for example, use Stimpack or the Barracks Go 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 ability. So it is possible that mech armies, when they become available to play en masse, things like siege tanks, for example, when those become available, and I think that's a long way away because at the moment we don't have any core regiments, we only have elite regiments, and it's very likely that the siege tank is also an elite regiment. But it is possible that eventual Terran mech armies will be more static. But Bio-Terran, or Terran that includes a significant bio element, absolutely motors. And by combining the firepower faction with the maneuver faction, you have a gun-centric army, because Terrans are not built for melee, that doesn't break the balance of the rest of the game. And that is, I'm very grateful for that. Now, Terrans are also probably the only army on release that I think have that activation control potential that I mentioned in previous slides, talking about things like the first player token and supply. There's a definite mechanical theme here that you can follow if you want to as Terrans. Especially if you have an army that is already trying to play a little bit wide, but even if you don't, Jim Raynor and the Terran Armed Forces Tactics faction card can combine to very significantly out-activate and therefore outmaneuver your opponent in the movement phase ahead of the assault phase, and then the Terran Armed Forces card can let you ignore the disadvantage of that by also being able to seize the first player token heading into the assault phase when the gun line opens up. Now that second thing, the Terran Armed Forces card, that's a once per game effect, but Jim Raynor is definitely repeatable in terms of every single turn that he's on the board. If he's running alongside a number of bio units, you just get extra activations out of him. They are extra movement activations, but they are extra activations. This can be used just for a huge amount of maneuver. You can theoretically fling a unit an enormously long way in Terran by combining all of these different effects, but you also get that activation control. Now, time will tell how significant that is. Even Terran guns are not infinitely long range. Much of the firepower is just kind of 12 inches. There are a few weapons that reach out beyond that. But Terran don't do their damage at extreme long range. They do it at a point at which retaliation is possible. And so while I am personally excited to play this style and see how far I can push it, my expectation at this point is that this activation control potential that Terran have, alongside their firepower done right theme, is going to be very, very good, but potentially probably not abusive. It'll be a thing that you can do that comes with plenty of its own costs, and which your opponent has repeated windows to respond to. Now, finally, in terms of faction impressions, the Zerg. At a glance, my initial impression, and this could be very wrong, is that I think they may be one of the more challenging armies to play, particularly once you get to 2,000 points. At the smaller points level, Zerg, they are a lower supply army. Not by a lot, but just by a little, it seems. They can run some quite aggressive one supply regiments. And because of how list construction works, your one faction card provides quite a lot of your supply and it is static, and all the rest of your supply comes from spending gas on buildings, and that's what scales with points. Supply at the 1,000 point skirmish level is more flexible, and at the 2,000 point is more constrained. The inverse of that is actually in play, where supply in skirmish scenarios starts at a much lower level, and accelerates at a lower level as well, whereas supply in full-scale battle scenarios starts much higher, as you would expect, and also accelerates faster. And so my initial list building experiences with Zerg was that 1,000 points felt both very comfortable to build for, and also like it would be very comfortable to deploy. But once you get to 2,000 points, those advantages felt like they would fall away and actually become more like constraints, At which point the challenge of the army begins to emerge, because a lot of Zerg regiments do feel like they've got clear, let's call it underperformance potential, which is not to say that the regiment is bad, but if you look at some of these regiments, you can really tell the circumstances under which they will falter. Durability especially can be pretty limited in Zerg. Roaches are durable as hell, but if you don't make investments into Hydralisks, they're not particularly tough, and Zerglings especially, if they get caught in the open, can die in droves. You've also got, relatively speaking, kind of short-ranged to no-range attacks across most of the army apart from Hydralisks. A lot of things need to get into melee, and even ranged focus Roach variants are just not very high range, and there's a big difference between 12 inches of range and 8 inches of range in a game like Starcraft. And so that leads to a situation where if you play Zerg kind of just a little bit suboptimally, I think those weaknesses will become very, very apparent. If your Roaches aren't in a position where their durability matters, they will just not feel strong. If your Hydras are in a position where their fragility matters, they will not feel strong. If your Zerglings are constrained by terrain and you didn't upgrade them to Raptor Strain, they will not feel strong, and that's just part and parcel of running a faction with these tailored for a purpose organisms. Now, despite all of that, actually, that's kind of an interesting theme. I'm interested in that, but I'm especially interested, and in fact, I am most interested in Zerg. I am really excited for them because, just in addition to perfect vibes, the Zerg Swarm has always been the coolest faction in StarCraft, and I will stand by that. Zerg have a mechanical theme of being able to invest temporary resources for long-term effects. And I am very, very interested in this. Zerg are the only faction across the game with multiple effects that stay in play across multiple turns. In almost every other faction, the things that you do go away at the end of the round. You hit the cleanup phase, and all the different stuff you set up over the course of the turn goes away, unless it's something like a structure that's meant to stay in play. Most stuff goes away at round end, but Zerg have lots of things that last. They have things like creep and the burrowed status, where you pay biomass, that's your faction resource that you get from exhausting your buildings each round. But once you have burrowed a unit or placed a creep tumor, those effects are persistent until they are cancelled, and your opponent can destroy a creep tumor by walking over it. Burrowed is something that will be cancelled because you will cancel burrow, because while a unit that is burrowed is much harder to attack, actually an enormously significant defensive boost for many pieces, Zerglings that are burrowed are often going to survive range fire, whereas they absolutely will not if you have them in the open. Even accounting for the fact that you as the Zerg player are going to cancel your burrowed status in order to then go and perform actions, doesn't change the fact that burrowed as a mechanic is something I can spend biomass on this turn to have a benefit that carries over to next turn. And when you combine that with creep tumors, which will stay around for much of the game, and then spawning abilities, things like corpses, so Roach Corpser variant can spawn corpselings, and spawnling Zerglings can respawn. Those abilities, I must note, they are very carefully balanced. I do not think those are abusable. As much as I always look for and love recursion effects, they are still mechanical tools that you can use to spend biomass, your faction resource, to get a benefit that nominally lasts for the rest of the game, or at least has a duration. Abilities that can carry over into the next turn and turns after that are the Zerg's mechanical hat, and that long-term play is super interesting to me. I'm already thinking about how I can use creep and burrowed and these spawn effects and combine units in ways that can overcome one another's weaknesses and support one another. And yes, I'm probably going to play that the first time and run into a Protoss army and get beaten the shit out of me, or run into a Terran army and get shot off the board, but eventually I will crack that. I'm very excited. I'm getting multiple factions for this game, but I am very excited for the Zerg. Now, to moderate some of the excitement in this video, there are a couple of things I think it is worth just flagging as stuff that is reasonable to be thinking or concerned about, because this is not a game that I am 100% optimistic about. I am mostly optimistic. I think StarCraft will be very cool. I think what they've done here is very good, but let's just turn our mind to some things that it might be worth being aware of. And the first of those is that this is a licensed IP game. Now that comes with pros and cons. And the pros are significant. The first is immediate brand recognition, just enthusiasm, the ability to build a player base at launch that helps a game get traction. That's a very significant advantage to a war game that is just starting out. Like, this is StarCraft, fuck yeah. We know what StarCraft is and we think it's really cool and we're keen. But licensed IP games do tend to have an expiration date as a result. Unless the creative relationship between the developers and the IP owners, that's Blizzard in this case, kind of flows in both directions, there is an upper limit to what can be added to the game. There is only so much StarCraft, and the developers can draw on all of that, but they can't make their own creations, which means that there is not an infinite runway. It's limited to what exists. Now, in this case, Archon Studios have actually spoken about this. This is something that they are aware of. And their own thoughts is that the ability of them to develop interesting content that expands the StarCraft miniatures game extends a long way into the future. I think they mentioned something like a 10-year runway if they really wanted to. And even after that, the game could continue to be updated with things like, well, obviously balance updates, addition updates, but then new scenarios, competitive variants, etc. And it will also be shocking if in the next 10 years Blizzard doesn't do something with the IP that results in further expansion potential. But it is at least something to consider. Basically, every war game that we have seen that is a licensed IP game eventually has to reckon with that and figure out what they do next. In some cases, that has a less than stellar end. A Game of Thrones is a very classic example there, where the Game of Thrones showrunners produced Game of Thrones, the TV show, season 8, and that was the beginning of the end for the war game. Now, I would be very shocked if the StarCraft miniatures game saw that kind of a negative externality of licensed IP gaming manifest, but be aware this is a war game based on a licensed IP, which the developers are beholden to the terms of their license. And so while it's likely to have a very long runway, it isn't infinite, and that's something the developers will eventually have to address. I've got a reasonable amount of confidence that they will be able to, but it's just something to be aware of. If you're going to get into this game, kind of think about, hey, is 10 years, is that about how long that I want to play this game before I move on to something else? Personally, that's a wonderful run with the game. I'll have a great deal of fun. It'll be well worth my time and effort if it does begin to draw down at that time. But it's just something to think about, that the developers will have to overcome this challenge for this game to have a longevity like something like Warhammer does. And then the second thing that I am personally concerned about kind of comes from my own wargaming history as an Infinity player. StarCraft, the miniatures game, has a very clean approach to a lot of mechanics, including how it handles movement and how it handles terrain. But that doesn't leave it an enormous amount to work with at release, emphasis at release, in the way of evocative or emblematic terrain experiences. This is a practical effect of how do we get terrain into the launch box, because we want terrain in the launch box so that players have an out-of-the-box experience where they have everything they need to play. But we're going to see an awful lot of L-shaped walls forming the majority of terrain for quite a while. And even the rules for terrain don't really seem to show off a bunch of ways that might expand on this. If you look at maps that are being used in Tabletop Simulator, for example, it's kind of a lot of that same stuff. And so a concern that I have is that if L-shaped walls become the competitive default, well, an opportunity is potentially going to be missed. So what I'm hoping to see is more from both the developers and the community on terrain and maps and board setup over time. I am an Infinity player. I love me some big and complicated tables where in Infinity, the table is the third player in the game. It has a huge impact on how the game is played. I'm not a huge fan of 40k style terrain. I want mechanical complexity, and especially relative to 40k style terrain, I want differing, visually evocative storytelling from my terrain. I want to see units creeping through canyons and tunnels on Char. I want to see a battle on an orbital station above Tarsonis. I want to maneuver through the snowfields of Praxis or have hallway-to-hallway engagements inside a Mobius installation. I want to see a nuked-out ruined street on Core and I want all of those to be a little bit different. And frankly, I also kind of want 3D printed buildings from the PC game that I just don't think will mesh particularly well with how the game does terrain so far. So this is something that I am just watching for now. We are in a very early stage. The terrain that we're working with is just going to be constrained by the fact that the developers had to figure out how, at cost, to get it into a starter box to give us something to work with. So maybe it will be fine. Maybe we'll see more from the devs. maybe we'll see more from the community. But if we end up in a situation where the competitive standard for StarCraft kind of mirrors the competitive standard for 40K, an opportunity will have been missed. So this is something that I hope I'm going to be wrong about and that we see a bunch on moving forward into the future. And so on that topic, what's next for this channel on the subject of StarCraft? Well, for starters, I need Archon to actually send me my models. I am apparently one of the last 900 orders in Australia that's going to get my stuff, and that's a bit of a shame because my order is the order for 10 people inside the local community. Archon, please, please send me my shit. Now, in fairness, this has been something of a suffering from success experience for the studio, where the orders that they received were overwhelming. That is, in the broad sense, super positive, because it means that there are communities out there that are incredibly keen to play. And when our stuff arrives, the community will be there to pop off. That's awesome. But I do really want it to arrive so I can actually play some games. This isn't something I have a huge interest in TTS for just yet. I want to play with the physical models. I want to put them together. I want to show them off. I want to paint them. And for now, I want that physicality. And that kind of leads into, okay, well, what are we going to do next? On this channel, content for StarCraft will probably be a little bit limited, but I do want to cover it, and I want to hear from people what they want to see. Some ideas that I have had would be things like hobby live streams, including unboxing and assembly of miniatures, just talking about the game and about the quality of the miniatures and how the assembly experience is. Faction-focused videos are something we could cover, although we will need to revisit them often because the game is going to expand significantly over the first couple of years. Battle reports, of course, and then potentially things like design commentary videos comparing mechanics in StarCraft to other games. I made some allusions in this video, for example, about how the supply system in StarCraft is an interesting analog to the light, medium, and heavy reinforcement system in Conquest. Is that something that people would be interested in hearing about? Let me know what you'd like to see. Post in the comments and give me your suggestions. Now, just to close the video out with that, if you've enjoyed this and you'd like to support the channel, click like, click subscribe, take a look at some of my other videos. If you'd like to support the channel financially, you can either become a channel member on YouTube, we have multiple membership levels, or you can make one-off donation via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below. Although my videos are free to everyone, I don't gate anything behind membership only. There's no tactical or analytical content that occupies 60% of the channel that you won't be able to see unless you're a member. I do prioritize requests from channel supporters about what it is they want to see. So if you're particularly keen for more StarCraft content and there's something in particular you want done, well, chuck us a coffee and I'll see what I can do for you. Otherwise, look, as always, I just hope very much that you've enjoyed this. I have a lot of excitement for StarCraft the miniatures game. I'm keen to see where it goes, how it plays, what I'm wrong about in this video, and what's coming next. And with that, I suppose, leave a comment, let me know what you'd like to see, and I'll see you next time.